This is the fourth installment in a series of excerpts from the war diaries of Kenneth Hulbert. He served as a lieutenant, then captain, and finally a major, working for hospitals in Egypt, the Sudan, and India. It was February 1942. Captain Kenneth Hulbert had returned to Egypt after 6 months in Sudan to a camp on the Suez Canal. His orders were to board a ship called the Andes, bound for the east. Rumours were that the destination was Singapore, but the island was captured by the Japanese on 15 February. The ship was grossly overcrowded with 4,000 passengers, mostly Australians of 7th Division who were in the siege of Tobruk. Just before sailing, some Australians heard that the destination was rumoured to be Java. An American naval officer in the dining room told them that now the Japanese had Singapore, they could attack anything within 1,000 miles. He said that it would take the USA 7 years to rebuild its fleet again after Pearl Harbor. The Andes sailed out of the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean. She was the only ship in sight with no escort, and so was moving very fast at 26 knots. This made the ship vibrate so much that the cutlery rattled in the dining room. They arrived at Colombo, the capital of Sri Lanka, then called Ceylon, on 27th February. The harbour was full of shipping and dominated by an enormous sign saying Lipton's tea. On 1st March, the medical team were told that number 18 General Hospital, the unit that Captain Hulbert was assigned to, was to leave the Andes and board another ship, the Mendoza. It was a filthy ship that had been used for the white slave run from Marseilles to South America. The crew called her the bitch. It was crawling with cockroaches, so the troops were given permission to sleep on deck. The condition of the ship wasn't the only problem. No one had unloaded the medical equipment, which was now on its way to Australia on the Andes. Without it, there was no chance of functioning again as a hospital. So one of the officers had to stay behind to try and get the ship with the equipment to turn back or retrieve the equipment. 5th March. On as orderly officer today, we are sailing north up the west coast of India with just one corvette. This really is a miserable ship. The sea, however, is calm, and there is sun all day and marvellous stars to see at night if you can't sleep lying on the deck. How wonderful the night sky is here. At 4 a.m. the sailors hose down the deck, and they don't bother to wake anyone up first, so we all sleep with one eye and one ear open to avoid getting soaked. I hope that this voyage does not take too long. 10th March. Sailing up the west coast of India, we arrived at Karachi at midday. The ship bumped the side of the wooden quay and did some damage. Then a message came, saying proceed back to Bombay. The captain nearly turned the air purple. However, it is reassuring to see the Union Jack flying. Eventually, 3 days later they disembarked at Bombay and boarded a train on the quayside. The joke going around was that would all end up in Pune, the spiritual home of the British Army in India. It was a bit of a music hall joke, because Pune was where one found the stereotype of the die-hard colonial army colonels, brigadiers, and major generals sitting on verandas sipping pink gin. The phrase they all quoted was, "Gad, sir, when I was in Pune." And Pune it was, which caused great hilarity. The officers arrived at Kirki, an important arsenal town just to the west of Pune, where they were billeted in an empty hospital. It was made up of single-story temporary buildings with concrete floors. Pune was nothing like the glamorous place they had imagined. Despite its reputation as being the Mecca of the British Army, it was drab, dirty, and dull. This was the watering hole of the British Sahibs and Mem Sahibs, some of the most class-ridden people in British India. They were also dreadful snobs, used to a privileged way of life, and regarded the Indians as the natives. Times had changed little since E. M. Forster wrote A Passage to India. The women were as bad as, if not worse than, the men. When the Queen Alexandra nursing sisters went to the club wearing their uniforms, one Memsahib was heard to say, "What are these charwomen doing in here?" The medical officers all felt that the apathy of Singapore, the complacency that led to its falling to the Japanese, was here as well and wished they were back in the Middle East. This was pre-monsoon season, when the weather was at its hottest and driest. The landscape was dry, brown and dusty. Every so often a small whirlwind came along and a column of dust went spiralling up into the air, moving like a drunken man. The wind sometimes came tearing through the camp, slamming all the doors and taking tiles off the roof. 9th April. There was heavy rain today, the first I have seen since last September in the Sudan. They call these the mango rains because they herald the ripening of the mangoes. It is a kind of little monsoon and doesn't last long. Then the failure of the Cripps mission to India was announced. Sir Stafford Cripps, a lawyer and Labour politician, was sent by the British government in March 1942 to try and persuade the Indian people to cooperate with the British in the war effort, on the understanding that they would receive independence when it was over. His proposals, which included post-war general elections, were rejected by Congress and the Muslim League. This accelerated the anti-British feelings, and worse was to follow. 14th April. The news is bad. Ghandi and the Congress are going to start the civil disobedience campaign. The sign "Quit India" is painted on the roads and walls. This just what we feel that we would like to do. 13th May. The whole atmosphere here is depressing with a touch of unreality. The V for victory signs are up everywhere, along with "Quit India" signs. At the hospital, life was a routine of surgical rounds and routine orderly duties, but the organisation was somewhat chaotic. The total capacity at the hospital was over 2,000 beds. Each ward was an army barrack block, a large stone building on 2 floors with thick walls and revolving electric fans in the roof. Then the monsoon began, and it rained and rained. By now life had settled into a pattern, and Kenneth was busy at work, which helped to take his mind off Jackie and the worsening political situation. Every morning the medical officers met with the colonel in his office and then started the day's work of ward rounds, orderly duties and operations. Many of the patients had malaria, dysentery and diabetes. On several occasions, Kenneth had to visit detention barracks to inspect the prisoners, a rather grim experience. Time off was spent on walking into Pune to go shopping, visit the club, the cinema, or the Chinese restaurant. 9th August. Ghandi has been arrested and is detained here in Pune in the Aga Khan's palace. All the other Congress leaders have also been arrested. This produced an instantaneous reaction among the people. There were disturbances and riots in Bombay, Ahmedabad, Delhi, Allahabad, Kanpur, Benares and many other places, as well as in Pune. All the British in Pune were in a potentially highly dangerous situation. Anti-British feelings were running at fever pitch, and Kenneth and his fellow officers were right in the middle of the cauldron at the place where Ghandi was imprisoned. People began destroying government buildings and anything that symbolized British imperialism. As the news spread from the towns to the villages, they started to blow up bridges, remove railway tracks, and cut telephone and telegraph wires. Trains were hijacked and draped in national flags, and there were physical attacks on Europeans. 12th August. There have been riots in Pune today, but nothing happened near the hospital. 13th November. Cable came saying that Kenneth's son-in-law, Jeremy Samsith, the son of his wife's brother Tom, had been killed at El Alamein. He had been serving in the South African Army. This was an important victory. the first major defeat of the Germans by the British on land, though a tragedy for Kenneth's Uncle Tom and his family. It was, of course, at El Alamein that one of the most significant battles of the war was fought. The involvement of the USA after Pearl Harbor in 1941, the Russian counter-offensive in Stalingrad, now St. Petersburg, on 19th November, and other victories signalled a turning point in the war. The Grand Alliance of Britain, Russia and the USA, formed in 1941, was starting to become a serious threat to the Germans and Italians. Meanwhile, there was plenty of work to do at the hospital. Kenneth was in charge of 2 huts with around 80 patients. It was a heavy workload. There were notes to keep up to date and no time for an afternoon siesta. He was mostly working as a physician, but also doing some anesthetics and also a correspondence course for the FRCS. It was a hard slog, compounded by the fact that it took 6 months to get answers back from England. 19th December. I have bought a skeleton. The procedure was to go to the Indian Medical College in Pune and go round the back to see the anatomy room attendant. He will supply a complete skeleton for 16 rupees, about £1. The agreement is that he brings it to your room after dark, wrapped up in a dhoti cloth. Now I have to paint on all the attachments. 25th December, Christmas Day. The 3rd Christmas of the war. I went to a service in the hospital chapel in the morning, then back to my ward where the Indian orderlies came and hung garlands, horrible wet flowers, around my neck. Christmas dinner was served on the ward at midday, but ours was a rather poor do. In the evening we heard the King's speech on the radio. The political situation was worsening. In February, Ghandi, who was still imprisoned at the Aga Khan's palace in Pune, started a fast. By the 21st February he was gravely ill. The diary entry for that day reads simply, "There is a very tense atmosphere here in Pune." The situation for the British, particularly in Pune, was very serious indeed. They were in a potentially highly volatile position. The popular response to the news of Ghandi's fast was immediate. All over the country there were demonstrations and strikes. Prisoners went on sympathetic hunger strikes. Newspapers like the Manchester Guardian and the Chicago Sun clamoured for Ghandi's release. Then, on 1st March, Ghandi ended his fast. A few weeks later he was taken seriously ill with malaria, and the Indian people demanded his immediate release. The British, believing him to be near death, conceded and released him. But this only heightened anti-British feeling still further. Then, Kenneth was told that he was being posted to number 72 Indian General Hospital in Lahore. He left Pune early in the morning on 6th March 1943 and caught the Deccan Queen Express to Bombay. With time to spare in Bombay, he went for a walk around the city and bought a Moffat's translation of the Bible to read on the long journey to Lahore. After the beauty of the Western Ghats, the scenery north from Bombay was flat and dull, just scrub, stones, rocks, and empty rivers. The next day he was woken at 7 a.m. by a bearer with a tray of tea and toast. An hour later, the train stopped at another station where the passengers climbed out and walked along the platform to the dining car for breakfast, as there were no corridors on Indian trains. This was repeated for every meal. The train reached Delhi at 9 p.m, and in the dark, Kenneth could just see the Red Fort. The station was swarming with people carrying tea trays that just popped through the window if anyone opened it. The next day the train passed through the Punjab where, from the window, he saw fields of waving corn and the golden temple of the Sikhs at Amritsar, just visible in the distance. By the time Kenneth reached Lahore, he had been travelling for 46 hours. He boarded a local train for Lahore Cantonment Station and arrived at number 72 Indian General Hospital. Lahore Cantonment was the British residential district an attractive area of wide, tree-lined streets and white bungalows set in large, shady gardens. As usual, the staff arrived first and the equipment later. The hospital was just a group of tents on the Maidan, open space, of the military area. Kenneth found he was the only Englishman there, as all the other doctors were Indians. By 11th March, the equipment was beginning to arrive and the hospital began to function. But at the beginning of May, Kenneth received further orders to pack up and move. The route was northeast towards the foothills of the Himalayas. Conversation on the train inevitably came round to the future of India. The Indian officers simply wanted to rule themselves, but didn't know how to get over the Hindu-Muslim situation and felt that the division of India would be wrong. Partition, of course, is what happened 4 years later. Many of the Indian troops had never been on a train. One of them pulled the communication cord and then protested his innocence. Another threw a lump of wood out of the window and knocked a signalman senseless. And another leant out and smacked a woman with a stick. At one stop, the Pathans in the unit got out a drum and did a war dance. At every station, the train was besieged with children chanting, "No mama, no papa, no brother, no sister, no cousins, no uncles, no aunts, no food, bakshish." Over the next few months, Kenneth Hulbert would witness famine Hindumen suffering on a massive scale in what is now Bangladesh. Thank you for watching this video. This was part 4 of 6. If you wish to watch the future installments, please hit the subscribe and like button to help support this content. If there are any specific military stories you would like telling, please let me know in the comments below.